This is a discussion of chapters 1 and 2 of The Handmaid's Tale. I've cut and pasted the excerpts that we're going to talk about so you can see them in front of you. Before we dive in, I think it's helpful to ask a few questions up front. So for the first chapter, I want you to think about how or why Offred describes what places used to be. This book can be kind of disorienting to read because some descriptions seem very familiar. For instance, when she's describing a high school gymnasium or when she's describing a college campus. But then you'll realize that the descriptions are also really disorienting because those places that we all recognize are different or they've changed really dramatically. So how does she describe what places formerly were? What can we assume about gender roles before Gilead? So we know that Gilead consists of much of the territory that used to be the United States in this dystopian world of The Handmaid's Tale. So what do we learn from Offred's narration about what life was like for women and what gender roles were like before the United States turned into Gilead? Also, what do we learn about those who maintain order in Gilead? A lot of students point out that the characters that they find the most threatening and the most disturbing are the aunts, which is interesting, right? Because it's not necessarily the commanders who are incredibly powerful and who take advantage of that power and who are oppressive, but to a lot of readers, it's the aunts that are the most terrifying. Why is that? Who maintains order? And you'll notice that there are all these neologisms, so all of these words that Margaret Atwood uses. A lot of them are combinations of two words. Others are words that take on a new meaning or that are a new job description in the Society of Gilead. I've highlighted in different colors things that I want to talk about. So in green, you'll see references to the first question or lines that speak to the first question. In blue, you'll see lines that I think speak to the second question about gender roles. And in purple, you'll see lines about maintaining order. So the first chapter begins, we slept in what had once been the gymnasium. The floor was of varnished wood with stripes and circles painted on it for the games that were formerly played there. The hoops for the basketball nets were still in place, though the nets were gone. A balcony ran around the room for the spectators, and I thought I could still smell, faintly, like an afterimage, the pungent scent of sweat, shot through with the sweet taint of chewing gum and perfume from the watching girls, felt skirted as I knew them from pictures, later in mini skirts, then pants, then one earring, spiky green streaked hair. Dances would have been held there. The music lingered, a palimpsest of unheard sound, style upon style, an undercurrent of drums, a forlorn wail, garlands made of tissue paper flowers, cardboard devils, a revolving ball of mirrors, powdering the dancers with a snow of light. So she's describing a place that all of us have been, right? A high school gymnasium. But she describes it in this very detached way, almost as if she's an anthropologist, just describing what she sees without assigning any sort of judgment. She explains the stripes that are painted on the floor, the hoops with the nets gone, which reveals what this society wants, right? They want to make sure that the handmaids don't have any way of hurting themselves or escaping those other escapes, as Offred calls them. And she also remembers school dances that would have been held in the gym, so the multi-purpose room of the high school gym. She can almost smell the sweatiness of the gym. Think about a gym that you've been to. Even if the school's been shut down for a long time, it has that lingering scent of sweat. So she can almost imagine what life was like before. We talked about this idea of the palimpsest, and here Atwood brings up the word pretty directly. There's so many references to this concept of the palimpsest in the text. A palimpsest is some sort of document that's been erased or scraped, but you can still see what was originally there. So you can argue that a building, if you can still see what the structure, what the architecture used to be, a building could be a palimpsest. You could argue that a college campus, if it's transformed into something else, but you can still see the remains of what used to be there, can be a palimpsest. If I write something on a piece of paper and I erase it, but you can still sort of see faintly what I've written, that can be a palimpsest. You could even argue that a person can be a palimpsest. You'll see this motif over and over again throughout the text. I think it's interesting that she recalls not just basketball, but school dances being held in the gym. We all know from movies or for our own experiences what school dances represent. And I think that she's kind of going through the generations here when she talks about the felt skirted girls maybe in poodle skirts that she had seen in pictures from a long time ago, then girls in mini skirts, then girls with one earring and with spiky streaked hair. She's also giving us a little bit of history about the change in gender roles. And Margaret Atwood wrote this in the 1980s, but she's imagining a dystopian future. But a lot of this to us might seem kind of familiar, right? I too have seen pictures of people at prom wearing poodle skirts or wearing very 1980s style clothes when I look back at pictures of an old high school. So we learn about what this room used to be, and we learn about women's roles before Gilead. I think the description of the dance is really interesting because she describes this undercurrent of drums, like she's imagining a dance that would have happened, but it's not really a typical description. She says, a forlorn wail, garlands made of tissue paper flowers, cardboard devils, a revolving ball of mirrors that powdered the dancers with a snow of light. There's something really disorienting and jarring about that. We all know about school dances and decorations and crepe paper flowers and disco balls, but it's almost as if she is describing it from this outsider's perspective. And it's sort of terrifying and carnivalesque at the same time. I wonder why that is. What do you think? We yearned for the future. How did we learn it? That talent for insatiability. It was in the air, and it was still in the air, an afterthought, again, this idea of a palimpsest, as we tried to sleep in the army cots that had been set up in rows, with spaces between so we could not talk. We had flannelette sheets like children's and army-issue blankets, the old ones that still said U.S. We folded our clothes neatly and laid them on the stools at the ends of the beds. The lights were turned down but not out. Aunt Sarah and Aunt Elizabeth patrolled. They had electric cattle prods slung on the thongs from their leather belts. So these women are in the school gymnasium, and it's important to note that Offred is a grown woman. In her former life, she had a husband, she had a daughter, both of whom were taken away from her. And we don't know what has happened to her husband, Luke, but we do know at this point in the story that Offred no longer knows where her daughter is and what has happened to her daughter. We learn a little bit more about that later in the story. I think it's noteworthy that Offred and the other handmaids are being infantilized. To me, this description of some sort of chaperone walking around and telling people not to talk anymore, given children's sheets and cots, but separated so people can't whisper and gossip and talk, right? Lights out ladies. It makes them seem as if they're pre-teens rather than grown women. So they've been infantilized in this gym. Not only are they being treated like high school students, but I would say they're being treated like little girls, like children. They even have to fold their clothes and lay them at the edge of their bed. Later, we'll talk about the significance of all of the names in this text. Sarah, Elizabeth. You might notice that a lot of these names are biblical. You might even do a little bit of research on Sarah and Elizabeth. Also names like Janine, Moira, and June. Okay, the last thing I want to say about chapter 1, and there's so much more that we could talk about, is that the aunts have power. They patrol and they have electric cattle prods. So they're not exactly like any slumber party chaperone. They also have the ability to stun the people in their charge, the women in their charge. But Margaret Atwood makes a point to say no guns, though, for the aunts. They could not be trusted, even they could not be trusted with guns. Guns were for the guards, specially picked from the angels. So we get a little clue as to the structure of this society and how it's very regimented. Everyone has his or her own role that they're assigned. Even the uniforms that people wear, red for the handmaids, different colors for different roles in society, indicate that you're not just an individual, you are a group and you're assigned a very specific role or function function in that society. The aunts have a lot of power, and yet they're using that power to oppress other women. So they have power, but not as much power as guards, certainly not as much power as angels, not as much power as commanders. And maybe there's a point being made there. One technique that people or oppressive regimes can use to oppress a people is to have members of that particular group, in this case, women, oppressing other women. That helps keep the whole system perpetuating, and it gives them maybe a slight feeling of control. That way they're less likely to band together with the handmaids and the wives and the Marthas to seek a revolution. Also, we know that many of these aunts are fanatical in their beliefs, so they probably wouldn't want to do that in the first place. Let's move on to an excerpt from chapter 2. Here are a couple of questions I want you to think about. What do you notice about the style of Offred's narration? What does the room tell us about Gilead's values and the handmaid's roles? Notice that Offred specifically says a little bit later in the chapter that she refuses to call it my room because it's really not her room. The door doesn't lock. She doesn't get to decorate it the way she wants to decorate it. Even the pictures don't have glass in them. So she refuses to call it her room, but we're talking about the room that Offred lives in or stays in. And even though the handmaids aren't allowed to read, Offred is perceptive to the nuances of words. You'll notice that time and time again in this text, she takes a word or an idiom or a phrase, and she turns it over in her mind. She unpacks it. Sometimes she makes a joke about the word. Sometimes she uses double meanings in the word. So Offred is highly literate. In fact, words later on, I don't want to give too much away, but when there's a forbidden game of Scrabble that is played, words become a type of fetish. They are forbidden, so they become something that excite Offred. So let's look at her description of the room. A chair, a table, a lamp. Above, on the white ceiling, a relief ornament in the shape of a wreath, and in the center of it a blank space, plastered over, like the place in a face where the eye has been taken out. There must have been a chandelier once. They've removed anything you could tie a rope to. A window, 2 white curtains. Under the window, a window seat with a little cushion. When the window is partly open, it opens only partly, the air can come in and make the curtains move. I can sit in the chair or in the window seat, hands folded, and watch this. Sunlight comes in through the window too and falls on the floor, which is made of wood, in narrow strips, highly polished. I can smell the polish. There's a rug on the floor, oval, of braided rags. This is the kind of touch they like. Folk art, archaic, made by women in their spare time, from things that have no further use. A return to traditional values. Waste not, want not. I am not being wasted. Why do I want? On the wall above the chair, a picture, framed but with no glass. A print of flowers, blue irises, watercolor. Flowers are still allowed. Does each of us have the same print, the same chair, the same white curtains? I wonder. Government issue? So you'll notice that there are a lot of incomplete sentences, a lot of fragmented sentences that just consists of lists. Why do you think that is? Do you think it suggests that Offred has reverted to a more kind of primitive, childlike mentality? Do you think that's that she's trying to maintain kind of an objective, neutral tone? Maybe it's a coping mechanism just to describe the layout and the color scheme of the room? Why do you think that is, that the language here is so fragmented? The reference to a wreath could be a reference to death. That's classic symbolism for death. But also the fact that you can see a relief, some sort of detailed, ornate structure on the top of the ceiling, but the chandelier has been taken out, and it reminds her of a place where an eye has been taken out of a face. You could say is another reference to a palimpsest. You can see traces of what had once been there. The entire house is a palimpsest. In fact, much of this text takes place on the campus of what had once been Harvard University, right? The pinnacle of Ivy League education in the United States has become something very different. The wall where people are hanged, yes, that's hanged, not hung, as in hanged, killed, is a wall that had once been around the campus of the university. Now it is used to terrify people who are part of the regime. So the description of the room also includes lots of discussion of the window, which opens partly, and it's pretty obvious here. The window opens partly, the chandelier is removed so you can't tie a rope to it. We know that the handmaids must be incredibly unhappy if the regime is trying to make sure they have no way of killing themselves, right? They're not really so much afraid of the handmaids running away because they won't make it that far, but they are afraid of the handmaids being so desperate that they would resort to suicide. The fact that Offred focuses so much on the window and the color white, it could just be a coincidence, it could just be descriptive, but windows tend to be symbolic, right? They can represent freedom or some sort of way out. White tends to represent purity. In fact, she says if she is able to bear a child, she will become as white as snow. She talks about wanting to be clean like the surface of the moon. So there's all these references to white, and then of course also to the color red, which is the color that they must wear if they are handmaids. Let's talk about the rug. So the rug is folk art, archaic, that means old-fashioned, made by women in their spare times from things that have no further use. This is very crafty, right? In this society, you would think a dystopian society. Most dystopian novels deal with robots or technology, but this society is really a regression. They like these cutesy, archaic touches. They like weaving. They like crafts that have been produced by women because it suggests, Offred says pretty plainly, a return to traditional values and using things that have no further function. Waste not, want not. Why am I being wasted? This is a famous proverb. You probably have heard some version of this before. Waste not, want not. The idea is if you don't waste something now, you won't want something in the future. Also, it's just a good lesson to not waste things in case one day you are in need of something and you don't have that anymore, right? Like never throw away a penny because it might be bad luck if one day you need that penny. So Offred uses these idioms or these proverbs, but then she unpacks them. Waste not, want not. I am not being wasted. Clearly, that's something that the aunts have fed to her, right? They say, you have this purpose. As a handmaid, you have this divine purpose. You should be proud and happy to be a handmaid. Why do I want? So she takes the idiom of waste not, want not, she unpacks it, and she questions what else she could possibly want, what else she could possibly ask for. It's also kind of funny in a dark way because, of course, there is plenty for Offred to desire. Her freedom, the ability to read, her daughter, her husband, there is plenty for her to want. So this idea that she shouldn't want anything because she's being put to good use is ridiculous. And then finally, Offred includes a description of the watercolor. The watercolor of the blue irises kind of reminds me of a really cheesy, nondescript painting that you would see in a hotel room or in an elevator or a dentist's office. Not really a provocative work of art that makes a statement, but something that is bland and blends into the wall and is relatively benign. It also makes sense that the handmaids are given flowers or images of flowers because flowers are a motif throughout the novel. We notice that Serena Joy and the commander's wives take a lot of time decorating themselves in flowers, maybe to feel more youthful or more attractive, or to feel like they have control over something. Serena Joy takes a lot of time tending to her garden, and she has control over that territory when she doesn't have control in many areas of her life. She also seems to really enjoy mutilating and chopping off the leaves and stems of flowers too, maybe to get out her rage at the handmaids and their connection to the commanders. The fact that flowers are still allowed also makes a lot of sense because flowers are the reproductive organs of plants, and it's a subtle or maybe not so subtle reminder to the handmaids that that is their function, right? Their function is to reproduce in this passionless way with the commanders, to bear children for the commanders and their wives. She wonders if each handmaid has the same print and the same chair. That kind of suggests that she's not allowed to connect or chat with the handmaids, which we learn later is true, in any sort of real way. That makes sense, right? If you're trying to build a repressive and oppressive society, you'd want to make sure that you separate people and make them fearful of one another and make them fearful that one will be a spy or will tell on them. So this is a clue that she has not seen the inside of other handmaids' rooms, that she's very, on the one hand, she has this experience that is the exact same, is identical to the experience of other handmaids, but she's not really able to sympathize with them or connect with them or talk about what they're going through. She wonders if these paintings are government issue. I think there's something weird about that, because when I think of some sort of government issue object, I think of something like rations or an army cot, something like that. But instead, this idea that the government would issue these cutesy pictures of flowers seems sort of bizarre, but very in keeping with the traditional values of Gilead.